All right, we're going to go ahead and call the meeting back to order. I'd like to welcome everyone back with us that's online. Good to have you back with us. So we're going to move on to a presentation, Carbon Mapper and California Satellite Partnership. Riley Duran is with Carbon Mapper. Riley is the Chief Executive Officer for Carbon Mapper and a research scientist at the University of Arizona. He also maintains a joint appointment as an engineer fellow at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where he supports other Earth science programs. For over 3 decades, he has worked at the intersection of science and engineering to deliver observational systems, including 7 successful satellite missions, ranging from Earth mapping radars to telescopes into deep space. Riley, welcome. Good to have you with us today.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we've got you. You look, everything's good.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. If that works, that's great. If not, I think Josh has a PDF, and hopefully he can step in. So let me just try this. And can you see my slides?
Yes.
Great. So thanks again. I'm going to talk today about the Carbon Mapper program, its roots in methane monitoring work that we started in California working with the Air Resources Board and the Energy Commission, along with NASA back in 2016, and how it's evolved and where it's headed, including a new satellite program with participation with our partners at the Air Resources Board. Before I go on, this opening slide is just kind of a snapshot to indicate the scale that we work out with measuring methane emissions. And the key thing here is using advanced remote sensing technology to make methane emissions visible at the scales relevant to local decision making by operators. And I'll share some examples of how we've been sharing this data with facility operators across the state of California and some success stories, and using that data to reduce methane emissions. I probably don't need to explain this to this group, but a general overview I give is when we talk about this subject is the methane moment, and I'm sure you're aware of the critical need to cut greenhouse gas emissions, both in California and globally. It's particularly true in terms of meeting the state's scoping plan. Short-lived climate pollutants and methane are critical components of that. And within the methane budget for California, emissions from the agriculture sector are key and important, in particular from enteric fermentation and manure management, both at dairies and other livestock operations. Probably the largest emitting sector, at least from our research in California, has to do with the waste management sector and landfills, and oil and gas is also an important sector, although not as critical in California as other states. The background for this program is based in about a decade of NASA-funded research on systems of systems for methane monitoring. What I mean by that, in this ARTIS concept, is we're using a combination of satellite technology, aircraft, surface measurements, and bringing these things together to address specific questions about methane emissions. And I like to say there are 2 basic types of monitoring for methane. Type 1 is focused more at aggregate scale understanding of emissions, for example, the state's greenhouse gas inventory, whereas type 2 is focused more on direct mitigation guidance. How do you provide data to facility operators and regulators that can drive action at local scales? And the Carbon Mapper program has its roots working on both of these, but we're focusing more and more on type 2. And while there's been a significant progress in the research community, as well as private sector companies in measuring methane over the last few years, there are still some significant barriers to scaling this up and operationalizing it. And they have to do with how timely the data is, complete, and in some cases, transparency is the data available to everyone who needs to see it. What I want to leave you with this slide is that there's no single measurement technology that can measure everything, is that we're moving towards a plan that uses a portfolio of measurement methods. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're trying to fill some gaps in that emerging ecosystem of monitoring systems. This slide describes the California Methane Survey. As I mentioned, this started as a partnership between CARB, CEC, and NASA back in 2016. We did 2 years of flights over California. This was published in both a Nature journal paper as well as a report with CEC and CARB a couple of years ago. And this just shows the blue and green areas where we flew the airplanes over in representative parts of California where we expect methane emissions. And then the little red dots indicate where we saw high emission point sources. These are emissions that stand out. And to give you some context, we surveyed almost 300,000 pieces of infrastructure statewide multiple times, and we found that less than 0.2% of that infrastructure is responsible for between about a third and a half of the state's entire methane inventory. So this is what we often refer to as the low-hanging fruit prospect for finding high emission point sources and mitigating them. And it's important to note that they occur across all methane emitting sectors in the state: energy sector, oil and gas, waste management, and agriculture. Basically, wherever people deal with methane, we do see this prevalence of high emission events. So the challenge and opportunity is to find them and prioritize them for mitigation. There are a number of data-driven mitigation pathways. The simple one to understand is leak detection and repair. Can you find a malfunction, fix it? But there are other emerging uses for advanced methane data, and one of which I'll focus on today is on the landfill and livestock sector. And it's not so much leak detection, but how do we diagnose and understand the root causes behind what makes one operation higher emission than another, to inform best practices and investment priorities. And so we'll give some examples of where we've done some of that in the state. The technology is something called imaging spectroscopy. It was pioneered at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory down in Pasadena. And it's designed to do a number of things, but for the methane application, we can detect and quantify strong sources of methane and CO2 emissions, as well as flaring activity. And the way to think about it is, imagine you've got a camera looking down at the Earth from a satellite or an airplane, and unlike a normal camera that has 3 colors, this camera has almost 500, and it's also quantitative. And so it's not that we just detect and image these plumes of gas, but we can quantify the amount of gas in the atmosphere, and then we can combine that with wind speed information to calculate emission rates. And so it's both explicit and visible and quantitative. I won't try to read every word on this chart, but just to highlight that there are 2 general types of methane sources in terms of how they manifest in the atmosphere and what that means in terms of what we look for, and then what can you do about it. And the way I like to describe this is there are high emission point sources, which are some of the examples I gave in previous pages. These tend to be limited to things like oil and gas production, natural gas transmission and distribution, some landfills and wastewater plants, and we tend to see them in the agriculture sector more along the lines of confined animal feeding operations, and specifically manure management that involves wet practices. That's distinct from area emissions. And the best example I can give you from the ag sector is enteric fermentation, where you have hundreds of head of cattle in a facility, and they independently emit relatively small amounts of methane, but collectively produce an area source. And I just highlight these 2 things because these have implications on the best measurement technology to detect a point source versus an area emission. And it also has something to say about your mitigation opportunities, whether you're trying to locate and fix outliers or leaks or malfunctions, or whether you're really trying to focus on systemic challenges in reducing emissions from an entire sector. And again, we're going to focus more on this upper category of the point sources. We need strategies to address both, and there is a wider ecosystem of programs that are trying to address this collective challenge. We've expanded since the 2016-2017 California study. We've expanded these studies across other parts of the U.S. We're now into 15 different states using a combination of satellites and aircraft. And those, by combining these methods, and this is ongoing NASA-funded research that our team is leading, we can both estimate the individual point source emissions and develop curves like what we see in California, and independently assess how much those point sources contribute to the state's total budget or regional budget. When we do this, we find a couple of consistent things across all jurisdictions. One is that these high emission sources of methane tend to contribute between about 20 and 60% of the net regional emissions. So that's On the one hand, that's good news because it's low-hanging fruit, and it seems to apply across most regions. The other thing we find is a lot of these sources are very intermittent and variable, and this is important in terms of designing monitoring strategies. In other words, if you only go out and look once a year or even once a quarter, you're going to miss a lot, and you may either underestimate or overestimate the emissions or miss a malfunction that's episodic. And so it's important to account for this. And this animation on the left just shows how variable oil and gas emissions are in the Permian Basin in West Texas and eastern New Mexico. And so it's important to account for this intermittency. Another dimension that has increasing attention and focus, very appropriately is focusing not just on the climate impacts at a global scale, but on the local scale, public health and safety considerations of methane. And that's because methane in high enough concentrations can pose a flammability hazard. And additionally, in some cases, there can be co-emitted there can be co-pollutants that come along with the methane, some of which can be toxic or malodorous. Devil's in the details. You have to make the measurements to understand this, but methane is a tracer or flag for potential toxic, malodorous, or hazardous events. It's something that is increasingly relevant to frontline communities concerned about co-pollutants. So I mention this because methane is a relatively easy thing for us to monitor with remote sensing, and allows us to prioritize where to focus looking at potential co-pollutants. I mentioned that we've been successful in California in using and sharing this data, not just to account for emissions and estimate them, but to share the data with operators to drive mitigation efforts. And this is an example of an effort that we've been working on with the Air Resources Board for the last 2 or 3 years, where we take continued airborne flights over California, and our team and CARB directly share the data with operators who are participating in this pilot program. And as a result of doing this collaborative data sharing, we've gotten feedback over the years from operators where they've gone out and been able to confirm methane leaks on site, and in many cases, they've been able to take action to fix the leaks. And this is just an example of a leaking oil well in the San Joaquin Valley, and these are measurements that we made with the aircraft before the leak was reported. We notified the operator the very next day. The star indicates they went out and fixed it, and then the green indicates where we did follow-up flights indicating that the methane was no longer seen. So this is an example, and we've got about 40 plus cases of this across the state, including other sectors like landfills, where operators have reduced emissions. And our estimate, based on just the sources that have been verified with follow-up flights, is we've seen about 1.5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in methane reduction through these voluntary repair actions. So this shows that there is a potential to use data to drive action, not just quantification. Just to give you some examples from the manure management sector, this is a mix of examples from CAFOs, not just in California, but also in Colorado. We see this behavior again at large livestock facilities, again, particularly where we see wet manure management. And so you can see that we're able to pinpoint the source of the emissions, typically to within a few meters. In some cases, we can show exactly where it's coming from out of a manure lagoon. And then we can, again, convert this to a quantitative emission rate. This is very preliminary, but I mentioned we've continued to do flights over the San Joaquin Valley. This is from flights that we conducted last fall over the southern San Joaquin Valley. And what I want to highlight for you, and this is not quantitative yet, I just want to give you a before and after. So the blue circles in this image are cases where we detected high emission methane sources in our surveys at these facilities in 2016 and 2017. You can see that there were multiple detections of plumes at the same facilities back in 2016 and 2017. And the green diamonds indicate locations where there are operational digesters in place. And what I want to highlight is that in this case, in fall of 2021, we only saw a handful of methane plumes at some of these facilities with the red dots. Notable that we see more at the facility doesn't have a digester. And so one takeaway here is that the observations are independently showing significant reductions in methane emissions because of the digesters. But we also point out that in some cases, in some cases we do see indications of potential leaks. We don't think these are particularly large, but it just underscores that with all engineered systems, it's important to have sustained monitoring so you can close these leaks. And so Stay tuned. We have ongoing analysis, and we'll try to get an actual emission rate numbers so we can have like a net reduction in the emission estimate for this part of the state. But I think it's exciting to be able to show independent evidence that these mitigation efforts are having an impact. Okay, I want to try to wrap up here. So monitoring systems need to account for intermittency and variability. I talked about this with the oil and gas sector. It's also true with the dairy sector. And so we've done this by doing repeated flights over multiple times a day, looking at how much the emissions vary within a CAFO. And this is something that we have to address in monitoring going forward. So with that in mind, we've established Carbon Mapper, which refers to two things. It's both the name of a nonprofit organization, a 501c3 that we stood up in Pasadena, with a public good mission to make actionable methane and CO2 data available globally for public good. It's also the name of a public-private partnership that we've established to launch satellites so that we can scale up and do what I was showing you with the airplanes on a sustained basis in California and globally. And that partnership includes NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, the California Air Resources Board, the commercial satellite company Planet Labs, and a number of university and NGO partners that have come together to launch 2 satellites in the latter part of next year, 2023. This is philanthropically funded, and that's partially because we're in a hurry to do something about this, and rather than try to fit this into existing federal research programs, we went out and sought and secured philanthropic funding to launch our satellites. The goal is ultimately to expand this constellation such that we can provide daily monitoring over all high emission regions on the planet, and again, make that data available to everyone. And I want to mention that in addition to Carbon Mapper making all of the data publicly available, Planet is planning to offer a rapid leak detection service. So within like a day or 2 or 3 days after each flight, for each satellite pass, Planet would provide leak detection service to those who are subscribing to it. And then last but not least is our partners at the Air Resources Board, building on the partnership, the research partnership we had starting with JPL with the aircraft several years ago, has indicated an intent to use the methane data from these satellites to provide rapid dissemination of that data within the state of California and to do more mitigation prototyping along the lines of what I summarized a few minutes ago. Last slide is this, just to give you a visual indication of what our mapping will look like. The gold areas we plan to look at probably once or twice a year with the satellites, and then the purple areas where we'll hunker down and focus for routine monitoring to support decision making. And this inset is just an example provided by our colleagues at the Air Resources Board of priority areas within the state for monitoring with the satellites. Sorry, add one last slide. The last but not least is making sure this data gets in the hands of people. And so we did establish a public data portal a while back. You can go to carbonmapperdata.org and look at the data we've collected statewide and other parts of the U.S. from the airplanes that show these methane emitters I was talking about. The plan is to build this out and to use it with the satellites as well. And I know that the Air Resources Board has their own California-specific portal. And you can go to their website here to see more about this partnership, as well as a link to the California-specific data portal. So with that, I'll pause and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Riley. That really is impressive. The amount of information you can get just by
Mine's just really
overflights.
quick, President Cameron. Is there a way you can put it back onto the global map, just as he's asking, or as others are asking questions? I just wanted to see that. Thank you.
Sure, here you go.
So does it generally follow the high population or industrial areas throughout the world? Higher methane output?
Yeah, so to explain this map for a second, the map on the right. So the gold areas come from a global map. It's an inventory of methane emissions associated with fossil fuel production and use. So it includes coal and oil and gas production and consumption. So you're right, a lot of this gold area is because this is where people live, and you've got, this is where the natural gas supply chain is delivering gas. This is really intended to be an example of where we might look. I include it because it also is the case that a lot of those areas in gold are where we also have a lot of agricultural operations and also waste management. So the other key sectors are enveloped by this. It's really meant to, is an example of where we're likely to focus once the satellites are in operation late next year. The purple areas are where we basically then tried to zoom in and say, well, where are within those regions, where do we think the highest emission activity is? In this case, again, it's focused on just on the fossil fuel sector, based on models of where we think most of the activity is. For example, if you look at this, if you look here in the U.S., you'll see a big blob up here in Appalachia, and you'll see a blob here in the central U.S. Well, those are the highest producing oil and gas basins in the U.S., and so and similarly, you can see this up in Alberta, in Canada. So, you would predict that those would be higher emitting regions. So that's the general idea. The actual, if you were to squint at California, you would see more of this inset map. So it's based on our best understanding of where the emissions are, but obviously this is going to be something we, as we go, we'll learn and refine the maps.
Oh, Michelle, go right ahead.
Thanks. Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious, are you, you're sharing the information with, sounds like ARB, and is there any outreach to these spots, like the folks that are these hot spots, whether those are the CAFOs or oil and gas or any of those folks? How is that information being shared, and what kind of feedback are you getting?
Yeah, great question. It varies by sector. And so when we started this program in 2016, 2017, we actually did some information sharing meetings with the dairy sector in California to share some of the initial findings. We have not, and I don't want to speak for CARB, but I don't think there's been as much of a focus there in the recent prototyping. Most of the focus there has been on the oil and gas and waste management sector, particularly landfills. And the reason for that is that we have had, in some cases, some of the mitigation opportunities, or if I can, more shovel ready. In other words, the leak detection, repair opportunities for oil and gas. If they know where it is, in many cases, they can fix it the next day. It doesn't require, a big investment. And similarly, there are some landfills that within, a few weeks or months of us identifying something that turns out to be a leak, they're able to act on it. Our assessment is that with other sectors, including livestock, as you're all aware, requires significant investment and time. And so this prototyping has been focused on more of the real-time response. And in terms of how it's shared, until recently, it was just us, kind of scientists to operator reaching out to them. I encourage you to talk to the Air Resources Board Research Division. They've developed more of a protocol which includes a standard questionnaire. And so what they'll do is they'll send the questionnaire to the operator and say, hey, Carbon Mapper saw a methane emission at this location on this date at this time. Can you answer the questionnaire? And the questionnaire asks things like, well, were you able to confirm it with a follow-up surface measurement? If you did, was it expected process emission or a leak? If it was a leak, were you able to fix it? What can you say about the failure mode? And I would say stay tuned for a report that CARB is working on. It's hopefully out later this summer, that describes more about how that data sharing program works and what are some of the statistics they're getting back as they build up a database of responses.
Hey, Riley, on your mapping, on your public portal, how often do you update, or what's the frequency of the data that changes on that? So how relevant or how timely is it?
Yeah, good question. So right now it's episodic because it basically follows, it's kind of a moving update based on when we do an airborne campaign. So, even though we're expanding with the airborne flights across the U.S. and into other countries now, they tend to be episodic. So we may fly for a couple of weeks in April and then a few weeks in May. And so generally within 90 days of each airborne campaign, we're rolling that data out. That will become more continuous and sustained when the satellites launch, because the satellites will be making measurements every day of the year, except where there are clouds. And so that data will just be a continuous, continuous roll out of data. Again, with some latency, because it takes time for us to analyze it. We put a lot of even though the computers are pretty smart at identifying methane plumes, the artificial intelligence, we have a lot of human eyes on it, analysts who try to go through and, throw out false alarms. And also, if it looks suspect, then we throw it out. We don't put it on the portal. So yeah, that's the current process. And like I said, you can expect it to be more sustained and streaming starting late next year.
Fascinating. Eric?
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak to the underlying sort of detection technology. And, when you put it on a satellite, I guess it's sort of like a finite moment where you're kind of stuck with the technology that you put up there. But how quickly is it changing? Is it getting better? Or obviously you feel good enough about it that it's ready to sort of shoot into space. But what's the trajectory of sort of the growth of that technology?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I'll go back to this slide. The technology we're using in the NASA world, we refer to it as imaging spectroscopy, because the way we think about it is every pixel in the image is a spectrometer. It can split the light into all of its component wavelengths. In the commercial world, you'll hear this referred to as sometimes as hyperspectral imaging. In the NASA world, people tend to flip it around and put the emphasis on spectroscopy. But the important thing to take away is this is technology that's been under development by NASA for about 30 years. Over $100 million in investment in developing this technology. And until now, it has been limited to a handful of airborne instruments developed by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And they're just now beginning to go into space. The images that you see here on this page, which is the current generation of airborne instrument, is what I would call second generation version of that instrument. The instruments that we're about to launch next year are fifth generation. So there's 3 technology increments beyond this. And so we feel really confident that the technology we're putting up is very mature, and it'll actually be somewhat better than what we do from the ground. The big difference being we're higher up in space, and so the pixels are bigger. They'll be 30 meters instead of 3 to 5 meters, and so we'll get a degradation detection limit. But we cover a whole lot, wider area more quickly from space. And then in terms of future innovation, you can be sure that the scientists and technologists are not sitting on their hands, that there's continuing efforts to evolve the technology. And, my experience in the space business is that somebody will come out with something new every year. And so, I think it's realistic to think that in a few years, on a 3 to 5 year time horizon, we'll see the next iteration of this technology evolve after the first round of satellites.
Riley, one more quick question. Do you see seasonal variation? Because you were talking about wet manure management. Do you see in higher rainfall years, do you see additional?
Yeah,
issues?
absolutely. In fact, a specific example, I can probably point you to the specific dairy here in Colorado. We did flights last summer. Here it is. In Colorado, we did flights both in the summer and fall of last year. He's jumping around on me. It's right here, this guy. And this is representative. We saw a factor of 2 variation in the emissions between July and September, largely because of temperature and rainfall in the Denver Basin. And we see, similar variation in California, not as much in the San Joaquin Valley, but we were actually surprised at how much. When I say the emissions, I wasn't talking the specific facility, but all of the CAFOs that we observed in the Denver-Julesburg Basin, if you add their emissions up, we saw it, really dramatically change from season to season. And I think this underscores why it's important to do this kind of measurement on a continuous basis, or at least a frequent basis, say weekly and ideally daily, because if you just go out and do 1 or 2 measurements a year, you're going to have to try to derive an average based on, 1 or 2 points, which is not going to be super accurate.
And one more real quick question. What about the effect of wildfires that we're seeing in California during the summer and fall?
The biggest effect we see with wildfires, there's an operational one, is when the smoke gets bad enough, the airplanes can't fly, and even the satellites struggle to see through the clouds. So a lot of us have been unfortunate enough to live close to those things, then, you can't you can't see your hand in front of your face much, and so the airplane's not going to fly. But I think the biggest direct example we've seen in California with wildfires is the impact on landfills. We have 3 cases so far we've identified where we saw a wildfire burn a landfill surface. It basically damaged the gas capture system, and we saw a dramatic increase in the emissions. It was like watching a wildfire, an invisible wildfire with all the methane, until they came in and fixed it. And the interesting thing is, in those cases where the landfill burned, because it required a whole-scale upgrade of the gas capture system, we saw a dramatic reduction on the tail end. In fact, the emissions after the fire were much lower than the emissions before the fire. So it just shows that, attention to infrastructure can make a big difference in the emissions.
David, we have, be the last question. We'll move on.
Thank you, Chair. This is more of a curiosity. I'm still trying to figure out, formulating my question, but it's really thinking about this technology and thinking about carbon sequestration, right? And that relationship between this technology and just this idea of carbon sequestration, and how, what that relationship may look like with this technology. Is there an opportunity to use this technology to understand how carbon is sequestered by working lands?
Great.
And verified.
Great question. So I served on one of the National Academy studies on negative emissions technology, and part of NASA's broader program some years ago in carbon monitoring. What I'll say is a little. I'll try to make this quick. When it comes to working lands, and I'll just say land carbon sequestration in lands writ large, both agricultural soils and in forests. It's complicated because it's very difficult to use atmospheric measurements to quantify the negative emission flux or the positive emission flux from those. Those are area sources. They present very diffuse signals. So the state of the art is to use proxy methods, and by that I mean using other remote sensing and surface-based measurements to quantify the amount of carbon, the carbon stocks in those reservoirs and the disturbances. And so in that case, active systems like radar and LIDAR are very helpful, but imaging spectroscopy like this technology is also helpful in terms of understanding soil types and the state of the soil and plants. But at the end of the day, it requires a synthesis and a modeling effort to pull all that together. It's not as straightforward as what we're doing here, where we can directly detect and quantify these high emission atmospheric fluxes. So it's a complex problem, but I'm excited that the state's working on it. I think some of the new provisions in the state budget on remote sensing to support exactly that question, sequestration and working lands. I think I'm optimistic you'll see a lot of advances in the next 2 or 3 years.
Thank you very much, Riley. We're going to go to public comment, see if there's any questions from the public. If you could hang with us for a minute.
Yes, if you'd like to make public comment on this agenda item, please use your hand icon and I will unmute your line. I'm saying no public. 1 second. Rommel, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Riley. This is Ramel. Thank you so much for presenting. This kind of technology is very much needed. And I'm wondering if there are any resources that you could direct me to better understand specifically what's happening within agriculture and technology that isn't yet commercialized. So I've been looking into already commercialized efforts, and there's John Deere and the like are doing their own thing, but things that are publicly, data sources that are publicly available is something that I'm interested in better understanding. So do you have could you point me in the direction of any of that?
Off the top of my head, I can't. There's a lot of work in the research community that the usual avenues are through journal papers. I'm sure there are people smarter than I am and do more focused on the ag sector methane writ large. Who probably point you to the state of the art. I know that there's a lot of discussion right now on how to do more here, and by that I mean addressing enteric fermentation, emissions from rice, and unfortunately that's not our research focus. So people that I know that there are people at Berkeley and UC Riverside and certainly UC Davis and elsewhere that probably have good resources. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I can't think of something that I would offer.
Thank you.
Anyone else, Josh?
I'm seeing no further public comment at this time.
Riley, fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed your insight into the methane tracking there. That's really fascinating to me. I'll check the website. But thank you again.
Thank you so much
for being a part of our meeting today.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to move on to our next presentation, Farm Bill 2023 overview. We have Sarah Arsenault with the California Farm Bureau Federation. Sarah is a director of the Federal Policy Division at the California Farm Bureau Federation. Sarah previously served as public policy manager at the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture and has worked on previous farm bills and federal policy. So welcome. Good to have you with us.
Go ahead and, is it? Okay, yeah. I'll go ahead and dive in. I am going to keep this to a very high level 30,000-foot overview. Otherwise, we'd be here all day long. As mentioned, my name is Sarah Arsenault. I'm the Federal Policy Director for California Farm Bureau. I've been there for about 2 years. Was in DC before that, working closely actually with Secretary Ross and Josh and others representing state departments of agriculture. So really happy to be back in California. As you know, we can go to the first slide and I'll kind of just give a brief overview of the political dynamics and the landscape of what we're dealing with when we talk about the Farm Bill in 2023. I think that there are a lot of pieces that come into play. I think this Farm Bill is actually very unique in that we have some very important political dynamics kind of up in the air. But to start, in the House right now, we have Chair David Scott from Georgia, Democrat, and then Ranking Member G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania, who's a Republican. And on the Senate side, we have Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, and who is also a Democrat, and then Ranking Member John Bozeman from Arkansas, who is a Republican. From our perspective, we are kind of waiting to see what happens after elections. We're going to see how that changes the dynamic and who will actually be in power, depending on how big or slim the margins are, or if nothing changes at all. I think that is going to definitely shift how Farm Bill negotiations go on. So everyone is watching this. I think, at any point, our priorities stay the same, and the ag sector is very focused on priorities that have been there in the past and will continue to be there. I will just note and today I'll also touch on things that are important for California agriculture. Obviously, the Farm Bill and priorities across the nation change a lot, especially when you talk about a Farm Bill and some programs that are heavily utilized throughout the Midwest. And I'll talk about that more in a second. But I will point out that Debbie Stabenow is a good friend of ours, as all the others are, but I point her out specifically because she has so much specialty crops in her state, which we are very happy to have her voice at the table and in a leadership position there. So next slide. So I'm sure we all have seen this or something similar to it, but just a snapshot of the pieces of the Farm Bill spending and where they're at. We know nutrition is a huge piece of this at 76%, at least in the 2018 Farm Bill. And then we have crop insurance at 9%, commodities at 7%, conservation's at 7%, and then there's other at 1%. So just wanted to kind of give that broad scope and overview. I know that we all have seen it before, but just a good refresher. So like I said, I'm not going to go through each title. There are a lot of titles, about 12 titles. I'm not going to dive into each of them or all of the specifics of them, but I will kind of just highlight some of the common issue areas of discussion that have been topics of discussion, I'll say, amongst the ag industry right now, and have been for a bit. We, as California Farm Bureau and actually American Farm Bureau, started this process as far as identifying Farm Bill priorities probably last fall. So we've been doing it quite a bit. As you guys are, I'm sure, well aware, there's been multiple field hearings. There's been one most recently done by Jim Costa in Fresno just a couple weeks ago that we and many other of the other commodities were at and spoke and gave comments. But like I said, I'm just going to touch on some of the major topics of discussion, I think, right now, and some of the things that we can see headed our way. Starting at crop insurance and disaster relief, I will say from California Farm Bureau's perspective, this is definitely at the top of the list. And I just want to give kind of a background and scope of where this originated from. A couple years ago, we were very, very keen on getting WIP Plus reauthorized, which is the Wildfire Hurricane Indemnity Program Plus. That offers support to, of course, wildfires and things of that nature. And a lot of our members actually utilize that program because there was not a unique, there is not a unique crop insurance program for every specialty crop. So they utilize that and then would have to get whole farm or some sort of coverage out of that program. But that definitely was huge for us. We got it reauthorized after a while. It's just now being implemented. And actually, there might be some additional movement here soon on another reauthorization coming. It is now called ERP, Emergency Relief Program. That's why I did the slash. So they are the same program. It was just renamed this year. But I am noting that because of all of that kerfuffle came this big prioritization in, do we need a permanent disaster relief program, or do we need to look at crop insurance programs and see how that can best fit all crops. Here in California, I forget that it's either between 63 and 69 of our 400 commodities have crop insurance programs, to give you insight into what kind of gaps we're looking at. So from our perspective, we jumped in and said, how can we make this better, along with many other folks in our sector and across the industry? And this is kind of where that discussion started. At the beginning, there was, like I said, a big piece and push for a permanent disaster relief program, even by the chairman himself, Chairman Scott. I think since that's kind of been walked back and focus has been reshifted on expansion of programs or crop insurance programs for specialty crops. And I think that we're still trying to navigate the ways in how we can make that happen, or what the best solutions are. Is it, expediting the process through the FCIC board? Once a program is submitted, right now it takes about 2 to 3 years from submission to the actual pilot program, which is a very lengthy time. Or is it, looking at whole farm revenue program, how can we change that to make it more affordable and more accessible to folks? So like I said, I think that there is still a ton to be identified there and which path forward we'll take, but definitely a key issue amongst actually the entire nation, and definitely here in California. I think that you will find that a common ground amongst the folks in our industry. Moving on to trade. Obviously, that one is very apparent for us here in California as we export so much of our product. Foreign Market Development Program, FMD, and then the Market Access Program, MAP, is things that we have been very supportive of in the past, and our members have utilized and actually are some of the key utilizers of those programs nationwide. Right now, we're asking for an increase in funds. I think, there are some folks in the industry that have noted they would like to see a double or those funds doubled. So we, as far as California Farm Bureau goes, we don't have our priorities itemized like that just yet, but I would see us probably following the same suit. And nonetheless, we are certainly extremely supportive of of both of those programs. And then also technical assistant for specialty crops. That has been something we've promoted in the past and will continue to do so. Nutrition, as mentioned, this is such a big piece of the pie. And I'm just going to, I think that we all kind of know a lot of the history in that nutrition bucket, but I'll just kind of float some of the things that have been new to the conversation this year as far as Farm Bill goes. One of those being a permanent food box program. So if you guys remember during COVID, the farmers or the food box program that was implemented, and then it kind of got walked back. Then there was a bill introduced by Congresswoman DeLauro out of Connecticut, the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, and it was to re-implement this. It was also to, re-implement it in a way that allows for more fruits and vegetables. It was very fruits and vegetable focused. So that bill it didn't go anywhere. It's still sitting out there in the universe, but I think that there is a lot to say about the introduction of that. And I think that there are definitely folks in the industry that are looking to see if that's a viable possibility and can it be woven into Farm Bill under nutrition as a permanent program that could sit there and be very beneficial to the fruit and vegetable sector. Moving on to plant and animal health. These, of course, all of the plant, disease programs, all of the aphis programs, we are very supportive of. As far as animal health programs go, I'll just remind everybody in the last Farm Bill was the first time we had this kind of three-legged stool is what it's referred to. When we talk about animal health programs, it was NADPREP, which was the National Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program. The Nuln laboratories, and then the vaccine bank. So it was all under the same animal health umbrella in the last Farm Bill. That was the first time it was implemented. Everyone, to my knowledge, in the barnyard and the groups that have been utilizing those programs are supporting that and will continue to. The additional piece to the animal health kind of puzzle, I'll say, when we talk about the Farm Bill, and I'm not sure if it's going to continue to go, but I will say when we went through the pandemic, we had a lot of issues around, backups and supply chain issues as relates to processors and things of that nature, specifically in the poultry and the hog sector, certainly in the beef sector as well, and some others, but the others might not have been so bad. But I do think that we did identify a need to increase funding for our national veterinary stockpile in the event of emergency. So that's listed there just as a potential. I know it's kind of been looming out there. I haven't heard of any rumors of that, serious rumors recently, but I definitely know that there are some groups that are very keen and focused on continuing or adding additional funding and measures to the national veterinary stockpile. And then lastly, I'll touch on conservation. It's a huge title for us here in California. EQIP, RCPP, ASIP. Our EQIP and RCPP are the ones that are utilized by our members the most. We've had great success stories out of both. But I will say, that title is huge. It's a very high priority for us. I list it here and at the end as a prelude into my next slide. Sure, we've all heard about now the reconciliation process. And Josh, if you want to go to the next one. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So we all know that there are a lot of climate smart ag practices and provisions within that bill. This is going through the reconciliation budget process over on the Senate side. So all of this is still based on if they can get the full 50 vote plus the tiebreaker. And then also the Senate parliamentarian has to give her blessing and say that this is keen to all the rules and it can be moved forward through this process. The House has indicated that they will pass the bill and the president has indicated that he will sign it should this work out in the Senate. So at a high level, it's coming at an interesting time when we are just approaching true negotiations of the 2023 Farm Bill because it overlaps with a lot of the same priorities. So at a high level, there's $20 billion for climate smart ag practices, 8.45 of which are EQIP, around 7 RCPP, around 3 CSP, 1.4 for ASAP, and then $1 billion for USDA conservation technical assistance. Again, like I said, we are huge utilizers of EQIP and RCPP. This is stemming from these programs currently being oversubscribed. So there is definitely a need to increase funding in those areas. I think right now the question is, what is the political strategy in moving that forward to be the most beneficial as a whole? So that leads me to my next point of, if passed, how this will affect Farm Bill negotiations. I think there are a lot of questions around how it will affect baseline. Will it increase baseline, which I think that it certainly will. But I think the bigger looming question is, how does that affect political dynamics? We know that both chambers and both political parties have their own goals that they want to reach. And if those goals are achieved prior to Farm Bill negotiations, what's left on the table for negotiating or for the desire to move it forward expeditiously. And then I'll go to just my last slide of how is California Farm Bureau engaging. So just to give you kind of a slice of where we're at in the process, like I said, we have been working with AFBF for quite some time on, and that's across the entire nation. They have a Farm Bill working group as a whole, broken up into 4 different committees. So we are chairing 2 of those committees and are very, very, very involved in the process. We actually sit on all 4 of them. The 2 we chair are conservation and climate title, and then also the crop insurance title. So we are hoping to continue, and we will be continuing to engage there. And I think that we're kind of we're almost at the process where we can, AFBF as a whole can announce, what that's going to look like as far as American Farm Bureau priorities moving forward to set the stage. I will say, just kind of offhand, I think that we, even as industry, there's just been so much going on, whether it was COVID or, what have you. It's been interesting to see industry work on this issue or this farm bill this time. I think that everyone is kind of saying, well, where are you at? Where are you at? And it's a little bit, behind of where it is, just because there is so much going on this time around. So, but with that, we have great communication and coordination with CDFA, as well as industry and commodities. That also brings me to the next alliance we're a part of, which is the Specialty Crop Farm Bill Alliance. They are great. They are broken up pretty similarly into the process that we're doing through the American Farm Bureau Federation. And they have specific committees that we also sit on a handful of, them being most importantly, risk management, and, conservation, trade, are some of the big ones there. Field hearings, as mentioned previously, however we can engage, we will. We've engaged in the ones in California already, and are hoping if there are more that will continue to be engaged, and just staying up to date with what really is being heard and said across the nation. So I think that's it. Like I said, very high level, but I am happy to take any questions. And also there is my email address. Happy to connect with you guys afterwards too, if there are any follow-ups.
Thank you, Sarah. We'll go ahead and open this for questions.
So I'm going to go right into the weeds, not literally, but kind of. Specialty Crop Block Grant Program has really been effective in states like ours because we're able to respond on the multiple needs of specialty crops that don't really get covered often. So obviously, I would love to build some support for growing the pot for that, but also there have been repeated requests by different commodities to be included as a specialty crop. And once you start expanding that definition, you either put all in or not. And there is, and because I know Farm Bureau has been very helpful to the many small farmers interested in hemp, I'm wondering if you yet know your position on hemp as one of many other crops that might be added to specialty crop, because there are so many. I'm very concerned about trying to focus on one, especially when its market is really not clear and won't be on the food and beverage additives for a while, and we are not seeing the processing at a large scale as a replacement fiber product. So I'm just wondering if that's something you've already taken a look at Farm Bureau.
Yeah, we've definitely taken a look at it as far as at the staff level goes. I think that we definitely need to have a broader conversation from the member level, and we'll probably have to create some sort of policy around that. But I will say, I think that it was, some organizations out in DC came out in support of adding that, and I think that that was a big shell shock to a lot of the specialty crop folks. So I think all of industry is shocked by that and is trying to work and see how we're going to best navigate that. But I think that your concerns are, from what I'm hearing across the industry groups, very valid. And yeah, shocking. I thought you might have. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Do we have other questions? Glenda?
Well, just something that you could comment on, perhaps. I was a little sad not to see research mentioned in the priorities, particularly given some of the conversation going on back in DC right now about cutting funding for ag research even further.
Yep. Yeah. So let me back up. None of those were priorities of ours. They're just large discussions going on right now. I mean, specialty crop block grant, obviously a huge program too. didn't have time to list it. Research is huge for us. We're always going to be supportive as far as, as long as it's in line with the policy that we have. But I have seen those conversations, has been involved in them, and we're very supportive of course, keeping a lot of the research pieces that are in there so far and not changing what's there already.
Michelle?
Thank you. In some of the work that I'm involved in, we've been having a lot of discussions and kind of shaping the use of FEMA dollars, both for hazard mitigation and also recovery, and just the role that green infrastructure, nature plays. I just noticed you had the crop insurance and disaster relief up there as a heading, and it made me wonder if there's any kind of intersection at all with FEMA and what they're doing and that, that area of work that you flagged there for funding. So.
Yeah, I'm smirking because I think that that's a great point. It's valid, and it's definitely been a part of our conversations. I think it's a very unique and creative way to think about funding and think about solutions. I have in my past career lives tried to work with some of those funds and cracking the FEMA nut on, as Karen Ross probably remembers, but it's a very hard bucket to get into, get access to, and a hard nut to crack. But we have thought about, and even I'll just say, there have been just brainstorming sessions with us and some offices on Capitol Hill of how can we do that and how can we crack those dollars. We have some folks that are now ag staffers that used to work with FEMA, so they have a lot of knowledge in that area, and they have actually tried to do the same thing. So definitely on our radar, we're looking into it, but it is not as easy as as we wish it would be. But I hear you, and I agree.
Just one follow. It seems to be there's more of an opening now than there has been,
Yep.
and right they've started to migrate into that space a bit. So anyway,
Yeah,
it's a good opportunity.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Comments?
I just wanted to follow up on that because it's come up over and over again, and there's wider recognition in the Office of the Secretary that Western irrigated agriculture and drought don't fit into a lot of the existing boxes. And even at a listening session that we did on drought impacts in Colusa last week, people wanted to know why we can't respond to drought. It's a slow-moving emergency, but one of the biggest challenges, and I think that's why FEMA, and I would recommend, and we're happy to partner you with our friends at OES who know it really well. I think that might be very useful this time around.
Yeah.
But the ancillary impacts in a community, even if the farmer is taken care of, and that's what the rice farmers kept saying, we have crop insurance, which doesn't pay me, but it keeps me in business for another day.
Yep.
It's all these ancillary businesses that we're scrambling to find ways to assist and to make sure we don't lose the community, the infrastructure, whatever it might be. So I'd be very interested in trying to pursue this, knowing how very challenging that will be. But in a period of climate change and the huge costs of repeated extreme weather events in ways we've not seen, and they've been in the last decade, it seems there might be wisdom to trying to understand what would make sense in a pathway forward.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that, although there's no silver lining, really to COVID, but we did see some of the assistance offered there, like, some of the SBA pieces that, was not just for the farm, but was for the entire community. And how is that effective? How is that helpful? And are those pieces that we could maybe implement, obviously not directly through a farm bill, but in other ways for future solutions?
Thanks.
Hey, Sarah.
Hi.
This might be an unfair question, so just to take more of your DC experience, I would appreciate. Could you give maybe a summary of how the California congressional delegation votes on the Farm Bill, and what are some of the key issues that I think some of the urban constituencies have with the Farm Bill, given that a majority of it is nutrition funding?
Yes. So you started right away with the majority of it being nutrition funding. So I think that, as I was saying earlier too, with a majority of the California delegation being Democratic right now, they're having a lot of their nutrition, goals and ideas, solutions, working through the administration. The administration, too, I was going to note earlier as I talked about nutrition, because I think we're going to see a lot out of it. They're holding a White House Nutrition Summit in September. And I think that we're probably going to see some good ideas and give us an idea of what nutrition looks like as we move forward. I don't need to list out how California delegation has voted in the past, but I think we all here know probably what that looks like given the dynamics. But going back to some of the political, dynamics and concerns, and especially if the Democratic delegation is getting their nutrition goals, accomplished through the administration right now, and maybe some of their climate goals through reconciliation. I think there is a real concern from some of the ag industry in what that would look like to be left on the table for them to want to negotiate. And, quite frankly, we are a little bit behind in the process right now from Sarah Arsenault's perspective in writing a farm bill. So I think that there are certainly rumors too, if it flips, are we going to have an extension, extension requested for farm bill, and is it going to be kicked back? Are we going to be starting field hearings all over again? So those are some of the questions, but you bring up a very good point. I think that, however we can communicate better the needs of the rest of the farm bill in addition to nutrition and some of those other key programs to our delegation is huge.
Bryce, go ahead. Go right ahead.
For the presentation, Sarah.
Yeah.
Sarah, I just to work off of Josh's wonderful springboard there. Farm Bill is usually bipartisan.
Yep.
That there's support across the country. Is that changed, or does that continue to be a bipartisan? That Farm Bill, as long as it has all the components for both urban and rural constituents?
Yeah, I think that it's a very fair question. It's a good question. It is a bipartisan bill, and that's what we always hope it to be. It is always, described that way, and from the work that I've done so far, it is, and I hope I continue to see it that way, and I think that we will. But going back to the partisanship piece, I think that there are some priorities, the Inflation Reduction Act right now specifically, that there are a lot of groups that actually can't really comment on right now because it is partisan, and some of their key priorities, I'll say some climate groups out there, ag-focused climate groups, I won't name them, but that are staying silent and not taking a position because it is not partisan. It is not bipartisan. So they're kind of staying silent while they might agree with some of them. As a whole coalition position, they can't really support anything without that bipartisanship. So coming back to Farm Bill, I think that, it continues to be bipartisan, and I hope it will be.
Anything else? Josh, could you check public comment?
If you'd like to make public comment on this agenda item, please use your hand icon and I'll unmute your line. I'm seeing no public comment at this time.
Very good, Sarah. Thank you very much for coming in and updating us on the Farm Bill. Really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Please let me know if you need anything in the future.
Very good. Thank you. Well, that should wrap up our presentations for the day. We still have
Public comment on agenda.
sorry, on,
Public comment on items not on
well, what about food bank liaison? We did not cover that. So we have had a history of having a food bank liaison as one of our board members. And Bryce, I know you have been the leader in that over the years, and we need to revisit this.
Good. It's good, man. It's, as long as I've been on the board, there's been a liaison, and I think it's a really valuable relationship. It's a relationship that has been in Ag Vision, and have we had goals in relationship to food bank and engagement with family farms and contributions to food banks. I think it's good to continue to have goals there, and this board can be, I think, very effective in helping develop those goals and meeting those goals.
So Bryce, I know you've been leading the charge and have done an excellent job over the years. So was that your continuing?
Well, my thought on
position,
that,
or-
Don, is that it's good to have a broad-based group, and Miles Ryder was involved as
Right.
as well as Craig, yep, and then Jeff Huckabee, and so I don't like to be the only liaison from the board to the food banks. So I really enjoyed the relationship with Driscoll, and it could be that there would be another connection with the Driscoll.
Are you volunteering someone to? That's not here.
I'll ask the question of any of us that are here today. Would you consider joining with Bryce as well? So
And supporting Janae.
and support. Yeah, terrible if you don't make the meeting.
How many members are you looking for? 1, 2, 3?
I can help, Bryce. I don't no longer work for Driscoll's, but I did. And I still have
That's not a
friends there.
prerequisite, but yeah.
One of the things that I would say about Driscoll's is they're active in this space,
Right.
and are I think very effective in that. So, but I think the more the merrier. And I think during COVID, the farmers in California have been very active. Amazing. There were stories of Jeff Huckabee that they'd been active in Kern, but when California Food Bank called, I think within a month they'd contributed 10 truckloads of carrots to North and Southern food banks, and just to see that sort of response from California farms, and I think that's what we want to help facilitate.
And just, it's of interest because we did increase the number of farmers who participated in that farm to family program. That was a state program before there was the one at the USDA. And I think the numbers are still higher by about 100 farmers, Josh?
I was just looking at that. We have over 330 farmers that contribute to the Farm to Family program with the California Association of Food Banks. And so that has grown dramatically since when we first started the process. So I think there's definitely a room for the liaisons to work with the California Association of Food Banks in terms of expanding the Farm to Family program. But I think there's a lot of new work, just as the Secretary mentioned earlier today with the update on the local food procurement program. And the food bank is a critical partner of that and that network, and connecting more farmers and ranchers to the process. Also leveraging the Farm to Fork programs as well. So huge opportunities for our liaisons and lots of good work.
Mr. President, if you are looking for a nomination, I'd be happy to nominate Bryce and David as liaisons, as well as maybe Janae as support. And they can reach out to Jeff Huckabee, since we still have the relationship there.
I think that's a great idea. Do we have a second? Oh, sorry,
Yeah, I'll
Frank.
do your liaison as well if no one else can make it. That's fine. I live down the street by a food bank.
So a friendly amendment to add Frank.
All right.
So David, Bryce, Frank, and Janae. Perfect.
Excellent.
She texted me. She's on board.
Do we need to vote on this? By affirmation.
Good, thank you.
Excellent. It's really a great organization. We've participated in the past as well, and it's just good to be able to help other people out. So. All right. We have public comment for what items not listed on the agenda.
Guess who's here?
And please limit your time to 3 minutes. Thank you. Do we have? Hello, Michael.
3 whole minutes.
Thank
I
you.
ain't gonna need all that.
Appreciate it.
How y'all doing today?
Good. Good to see
I'm
you.
not gonna use all 3 minutes. And I like your new hairstyle. I love it. I love it. My name is Michael Harris. I represent Black Farmers and Ag Association, and transitioning into urban ag, since some of you may have, back in the day, I think it was a 2002 Farm Bill conversation. They were like, well, you urban ag, you got to get out of here. We don't do that. Well, this is urban ag. I said, I don't know why you tell me something like that. So now there's an Office of Urban Ag, and we put together a coalition in the '08 Farm Bill, and I'm still recovering from that. Secretary Ross will tell you, I lost a good woman, I lost a whole bunch of good stuff. But we gained a lot in policy, a lot of good stuff that's just now hitting the deck. One of the things that's happening, I want you to, Josh, I'll send you all the information because it's a big meeting tonight. There's a Golden Harvest Parade and Festival that's happening October 28th to 30th in our backyard, right here in Sacramento. Some of you all remember Gold Rush Days. Some of you remember Pacific Rim Festival, and they're kind of putting that together. I get a call from CC Yin, and I was like, Lord have mercy. This is a good thing. And it put me to work. But CC, Apapa, Asian Pacific Islander, they're spearheading this, and tonight's a big call. But the idea is to really highlight California-grown fresh fruits and vegetables, ethnic diverse specialty crops, the food that we eat, everybody eats, when we go to different restaurants that we usually can't cook at home because we don't know how to do it. But the idea is that everybody's coming together to do it at Old Sacramento. So I'll have some good information tonight. And of course, when they start talking about Golden Harvest and then the logo is like wheat and the grapes, and I was like laughing. I was like, this is heaven right here. So I want to invite everything. Finally, the Farm Bill, it's going to be interesting, but the Black Caucus Foundation is the end of September. Hopefully, COVID won't stop 55 or 56 presidents from Africa meeting at the end of September. And I'm going to put on suit and tie and be on good behavior. But there's an inordinate amount of opportunity. And I said I'd be short on 3 minutes, so I'll be quiet. This month is going to be magical. Next month, even more so. But hopefully we don't get burnt up. And rain will just keep flashing out of nowhere because God wants to keep us from burning up again 3 years in a row. But I just want to thank you all for what you're doing and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone else? Could you check online for us, Josh?
Yes, if you would like to make a public comment on items not on the agenda, please use your hand icon and I will unmute your line. I'm seeing no public comment at this time.
Okay. We are on time today. I'd like to thank all of the board members that made the effort to get here. Great to see everybody again, and hope you have a safe journey home. Thank you again. We're adjourned.